There is a discipline I've tried to practice throughout my career, in markets, in geopolitics, in any domain where the official explanation and the actual explanation have a meaningful gap between them. The discipline is this: when an event occurs that has powerful, well-resourced actors on multiple sides, and when the official explanation for why the event happened is simple, emotionally satisfying, and tidy, that is precisely when you should slow down. Not because the official explanation is always wrong, but because events that serve the interests of multiple powerful actors simultaneously are almost never as simple as the explanation offered for them. The conflict in the Middle East that is currently reshaping energy markets, monetary systems, and the geopolitical balance of power is one of those events. I want to be very precise about what I mean by this. I'm not suggesting that the stated reasons for any of the decisions being made are entirely fabricated. I'm not offering a conspiracy theory. I am applying the same analytical framework I've used throughout my career, the framework of asking who benefits, what the structural incentives are, and what the historical pattern of similar moments reveals about the actual forces at work. When I apply that framework to the current situation, what I find is not a simple story. What I find is a convergence, a moment where multiple distinct sets of interests, operating from different institutional positions with different motivations, all pointed toward the same outcome. And when that kind of convergence occurs, the nominal trigger, the official explanation, is almost always downstream of forces that were already in motion long before the immediate event. Iran was never about Iran. Let me explain what I mean. Before I get into the specific dynamics of the current moment, I want to give you the analytical framework I use, because the framework is more valuable than any specific conclusion I might draw from it, and because I think most of the available commentary on geopolitical events fails at the level of framework before it even gets to the level of analysis. The most common failure is what I'd call single cause thinking. The search for the one reason, the one actor, the one decision that explains why something happened. This is cognitively satisfying. It produces clean narratives. It makes for compelling headlines. And it is almost always wrong when applied to events that involve multiple powerful actors with overlapping but distinct interests. Complex geopolitical events, wars, sanctions regimes, major shifts in trade architecture are almost never the product of a single cause or a single actor. They are the product of what I think of as interest convergence, the simultaneous alignment of multiple distinct sets of interests around a common outcome, where each set of actors is pursuing its own rational objectives, and where the outcome is the result of all of those pursuits coinciding. Understanding this is not the same as saying the outcome was inevitable or that it was coordinated by some central authority. It's saying that in complex systems with multiple powerful actors, events that serve multiple interests simultaneously tend to happen more often than events that serve only one. Not because of conspiracy, because of incentive alignment. The second analytical failure is presentism, the tendency to analyze a current event as if it arose spontaneously from its immediate context, without recognizing that the structural conditions enabling it were built over years or decades. Major geopolitical events almost always have long lead times. The conditions that make them possible, the alliances, the economic dependencies, the technological capabilities, the institutional arrangements, are assembled gradually, often invisibly, long before the proximate trigger occurs. When you look at the current conflict in the Middle East through both of these lenses, through the lens of interest convergence and through the lens of long lead structural preparation, what you see is very different from what the immediate news cycle presents. Let me show you what I mean. I want to identify the distinct structural interests that converge in the current moment, not to assign blame or to make political judgments, but to understand the forces that have been shaping events. There are, in my analysis, 4 distinct interest clusters, and understanding each of them separately before understanding how they interact is essential. The first structural interest is sovereign power preservation. Every major nation-state that is party to or affected by the current conflict is operating at some level from the logic of sovereign power preservation, the imperative to maintain or expand its capacity to determine its own fate in an increasingly competitive multipolar world. For the United States, this means maintaining the dollar's reserve currency status, the primacy of American-aligned financial infrastructure, and the leverage that comes from controlling the flows of energy on which other major economies depend. For the countries on the other side of this contest, it means building the economic and military architecture that reduces their dependency on American-controlled systems. What is critical to understand is that sovereign power, in the current era, is not primarily expressed through military force. It is expressed through control over the flows of energy, of money, of information, of the technology that underlies all three. The country that controls those flows controls the terms on which every other country must operate. Military force is one tool for securing those flows, but it is increasingly one tool among many, and not always the most decisive one. The second structural interest is energy architecture control. Energy is not a commodity like other commodities. It is the foundational input, the resource without which nothing else in a modern economy functions. And the specific routes through which energy moves, the sea lanes, the pipelines, the choke points, are strategic assets whose control confers leverage that extends far beyond the energy sector. The current conflict's epicenter, the Persian Gulf region and the strait through which a significant fraction of the world's daily oil supply flows, is not coincidentally located. It is the most strategically significant energy choke point on the planet. Any major power that controls or denies access to that choke point has leverage over every other economy that depends on oil flowing through it. That leverage is not theoretical. It is expressed every day in the pricing of energy, in the routing decisions of tankers, and in the diplomatic calculations of every government that needs to import oil. The structural interest in controlling or contesting that choke point predates the current conflict by decades. What has changed is not the strategic logic. What has changed is the set of capabilities and the configuration of alliances that determine who can actually exercise that control. The third structural interest is the monetary system transition. I've discussed this extensively in previous videos, the long-running contest between the existing dollar-based monetary architecture and the alternative systems being constructed around it. This contest did not begin with the current conflict. It accelerated significantly in 2022 when the decision to freeze a major country's dollar reserves demonstrated, more clearly than any theoretical argument could, that dollar-denominated assets could be used as a weapon against any country that the United States deemed adversarial. That demonstration changed the calculus for every central bank and sovereign wealth fund in the world. The question shifted from how do we maximize returns in dollar assets to how much dollar asset exposure is prudent given the demonstrated risk that those assets can be frozen or seized. The answers to that question, translated into actual capital flows, actual gold accumulation, actual alternative payment system construction, are the structural preconditions of the current moment. The current conflict is simultaneously a product of this monetary contest and a further catalyst for it. Every day that the energy choke point remains contested, every day that major economies are forced to find alternative routes and alternative settlement mechanisms for their energy purchases, the alternative monetary architecture becomes more developed and more legitimate. The fourth structural interest is technological supremacy. This is perhaps the least understood of the four structural interests, but in many ways the most consequential for the long-term trajectory of the current contest. We are living through a period in which the technology that underlies economic and military capability is being fundamentally restructured. Artificial intelligence, advanced computing, communications infrastructure, and the financial technology that enables payment systems and monetary control. These are the strategic resources of the current era, in the same way that industrial capacity and energy reserves were the strategic resources of the 20th century. The contest over these resources, over who controls the AI systems, who builds the payment infrastructure, who owns the data centers that run the critical digital infrastructure of the global economy, is not separate from the military and economic conflicts we observe. It is the same contest expressed in a different domain. And critically, the data centers, the AI systems, and the financial infrastructure that enable the modern economy are not purely civilian assets in the way that 20th century industrial infrastructure was. They are dual-use assets, simultaneously commercial and strategic, in ways that are reshaping the nature of conflict itself. Let me now describe how these four structural interests converge in the current moment, because it is the convergence, not any single interest, that explains why the event happened when it did and why it has taken the form it has. The convergence works like this. The sovereign power interest of the United States requires maintaining leverage over the economies of its primary geopolitical competitors. The most efficient form of that leverage, given the energy dependencies of those competitors, is control over energy flows, specifically over the choke points through which the energy flows. The energy architecture interest requires that the specific choke points remain within the influence of American-aligned actors, rather than being available as a tool of leverage for adversarial powers. The monetary system interest requires that oil continue to be priced in dollars, because the petrodollar arrangement is the structural foundation of dollar reserve currency demand, and any significant erosion of that arrangement accelerates the monetary transition away from dollar dominance that adversarial powers have been building toward. The technological supremacy interest requires that the digital and financial infrastructure being built during this transition, the AI systems, the payment networks, the data centers, be built within a framework that is compatible with American strategic interests rather than as an alternative to them. All four of these interests pointed toward the same strategic objective: preventing the construction of an alternative energy monetary technological architecture that would allow major adversaries to operate outside the reach of American leverage. And the specific geography of the current conflict, the Persian Gulf, the energy choke points, the countries that have been most active in building the alternative architecture, is not coincidental. It is the precise location where the contest between the existing system and the emerging alternative has been most directly expressed. This is what I mean when I say Iran was never about Iran. Iran is a piece of the board in a much larger strategic game, a game whose structure has been developing for decades and whose current moves are driven by the convergence of interests I've described, not by the proximate events that the immediate news cycle focuses on. Let me now turn to what this means for the global economic architecture, because I think the consequences of the current moment extend well beyond the immediate geopolitical situation, and those consequences are directly relevant to how serious investors and serious citizens should be thinking about the decade ahead. The first and most immediate consequence is the energy price transmission I've discussed in previous videos. A sustained disruption to a major global energy choke point translates into higher energy costs for every economy that depends on imports through that route. Those higher costs translate into inflationary pressure across the entire cost structure of those economies, through transportation, through manufacturing, through agriculture, through everything that uses energy as an input. This is not speculation. It is the mechanism by which every major oil supply disruption in the past 50 years has affected the global economy. The second consequence is the monetary acceleration. Every day that the current conflict persists, every day that major oil importing countries are forced to find alternative routes, alternative suppliers, and alternative settlement mechanisms, the alternative monetary architecture becomes more developed. Countries that have been building alternative payment systems out of precaution are now using them out of necessity. The practical experience of transacting outside the dollar system is accumulating rapidly. And practical experience, unlike theoretical preparation, tends to produce durable behavioral change. The third consequence, and this is the one I think is most underappreciated, is the technology governance precedent. The decisions being made right now about which AI systems are used for what purposes, which data infrastructure is treated as strategic military assets and which is treated as commercial civilian infrastructure, and who has access to the most powerful technological capabilities, decisions are being made at a pace and under conditions that do not allow for the careful deliberation that their long-term significance deserves. And the precedents being set now will shape the governance of AI and digital infrastructure for decades. The country or coalition of countries that establishes dominant positions in AI capability, in payment infrastructure, and in the digital identity systems that will underlie future financial transactions, is establishing leverage that will compound, not for months, for decades. And the current conflict, whatever its immediate resolution, is simultaneously a product of and a catalyst for that technological competition. I want to ground what I've been describing in the historical pattern, because I think the historical context is both sobering and in some ways clarifying. Throughout history, the transitions between dominant global powers, the periods when one hegemonic arrangement gives way to another, have been characterized by a specific set of dynamics. They are rarely clean, they are rarely peaceful, and they are almost never resolved on the timeline that either the incumbent power or the challenger anticipates. What history consistently shows is that these transitions involve a period of contested order, a period in which the rules that governed the previous arrangement no longer hold with certainty, but the new rules have not yet been established. During this period of contested order, events that would have been unthinkable under the old rules become possible. Conflicts that would have been contained by the old institutional architecture become unconstrained. We are, I believe, in one of those periods of contested order. The old rules, the rules that have governed international economic and military behavior since the post-war settlement, are under genuine challenge. The new rules have not been established. And the specific events we are living through, the military conflicts, the monetary experiments, the technological races, are the process by which those new rules are being determined. This is not comfortable. Periods of contested order are, by their nature, uncomfortable. They are characterized by uncertainty, volatility, and the genuine possibility of outcomes that seemed inconceivable under the old order. But they are also, for those who understand what is happening and who position themselves accordingly, periods of significant opportunity. Not opportunity in the narrow financial sense of finding the right trade. Opportunity in the broader sense of being on the right side of the structural forces that will shape the next era. The investors, the institutions, and the countries that understood the structural forces of the previous era, that positioned themselves for the dollar's dominance, for the financialization of global assets, for the specific configuration of the post-war order, generated extraordinary wealth for those who benefited from that positioning. The investors, institutions, and countries that understand the structural forces of the emerging era, that position themselves for the monetary transition, for the shift in energy architecture, for the technological competition, will likely do the same over the coming decades. Understanding those forces, clearly without panic, without either dismissing their significance or catastrophizing their implications, is the most valuable thing I can offer. Let me close with the practical framework for how to think and act in a period of contested order, because the analysis I've provided is only useful to the extent that it informs real decisions. The first principle is distinguish between the weather and the climate. The weather is the day-to-day, week-to-week movement of events, the negotiations, the military developments, the policy announcements, the market reactions to each of these. This weather is real. It has real consequences for specific positions and specific time horizons, but it is not the climate. The climate is the multi-year, multi-decade structural trajectory, the direction in which the monetary system is moving, the direction in which the balance of technological capability is moving, the direction in which the energy architecture is moving. Positioning for the weather is trading. Positioning for the climate is investing. In a period of contested order, the weather becomes dramatically more volatile than in periods of stable order. The swings are larger. The reversals are more frequent. The relationship between any given development and the long-term structural trajectory is harder to read in real time. This makes weather-based positioning more difficult and more expensive. Climate-based positioning, holding assets and structural exposures that benefit from the long-term trajectory regardless of the specific path it takes, is more durable. It is not without risk. The climate itself can change, and the structural forces I've described can resolve differently from what the current evidence suggests. But the uncertainty of the path is not the same as the uncertainty of the direction. And the direction, when viewed through the lens of the structural forces at work, seems clearer than the day-to-day volatility suggests. The second principle is understand which side of the structural forces your current positioning puts you on. The transition I've been describing, from the dollar-based, financialization-driven American hegemonic order to whatever comes next, has winners and losers, not in a moralistic sense, in a structural sense. Some assets benefit from the continuation of the existing order. Some assets benefit from the transition to something different. Most portfolios that were built for the existing order have not been rebalanced for the structural forces that are now clearly in motion. This doesn't require dramatic action. It requires honest assessment of where your current positioning sits relative to the structural forces and deliberate adjustment that reflects that assessment. The third principle is the one I always return to: prepare. Don't predict. I don't know exactly how the current conflict resolves. I don't know the specific path of the monetary transition. I don't know the timeline of the technological competition. What I know is that the structural forces are real, that they are moving in identifiable directions, and that the gap between being prepared for those directions and being unprepared for them is likely to be very consequential over the coming decade. Preparation. Building positioning that is resilient across the range of likely outcomes, with particular attention to the scenarios that the current consensus underweights, is the most honest and most useful response to genuine uncertainty at this scale. Before my closing thoughts, 3 brief things. First, I've put together a framework document covering how I think about geopolitical risk and its implications for portfolio positioning, the specific categories of structural force I monitor, the indicators I watch, and the principles I use to distinguish weather from climate in a period of contested order. It's in the description, completely free. Second, if you want to go deeper on the intersection of geopolitics, monetary systems, and investment positioning in a community of serious thinkers who are committed to understanding these forces with clear eyes, I've built that space. Details are in the description. Third, if this kind of honest, structural analysis is useful to you, subscribe. These forces are going to keep developing. I intend to keep tracking them as honestly as I can. The title of this video is "Iran Was Never About Iran," by which I mean this: the specific geography, the specific actors, and the specific immediate events of the current conflict are the visible surface of forces that have been building for decades. Forces rooted in the contest over monetary primacy, over energy architecture, over technological supremacy, and over the fundamental question of who gets to write the rules in the next global order. Understanding those forces, tracing them back to their structural roots, understanding how the interests converge, recognizing the historical pattern of which this is the latest expression, doesn't make the uncertainty smaller. The uncertainty is real. The range of possible outcomes is genuinely wide, but it does make the uncertainty navigable. It gives you a framework for distinguishing what is signal and what is noise. It gives you the historical grounding to hold your analysis steady when the immediate events are moving fast and the dominant narrative is loud. The countries and investors who understood the structural forces of the post-war order when it was being established made extraordinary returns over the decades that followed. The countries and investors who understand the structural forces of the order that is now being contested and who position accordingly are likely to do the same over the decades ahead. That understanding begins with recognizing that the most important events are rarely about what they appear to be about on the surface. Iran was never about Iran. I'll see you in the next one.